I'll be happy knowing that I put this in a document so that in 5 years' time, when we're in the gulag, we'll at least we said something.
I think they're all insane.
Ladies and gents, welcome to another episode of Hidden Perspective. This is Rob Greco. It's good to be back, joined by my mate stranded in Prison Island on the other side of the world, growing a lockdown ISO beard, however you wanted to phrase it. Jules, what's going on, my man?
Lockdown Island. Is that Australia's new name, is it?
Yeah, Lockdown Island, Prisoner Island. It's what would you call it?
The land of zero, mate. The
land of zero.
The land of zero.
Fortress Australia.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Certainly the media expectations are that we're going to be in lockdown for months and that we're basically not going to be able to open until we hit some magic vaccine number. And I really do hope magic vaccine numbers are actual magic vaccine numbers. Are you going to stay out of lockdown? You guys are free now, aren't you?
Well, that's the thing. So we have at least 75% of people over the age of 12 who have at least one dose, and we have cases ticking up again after being fully reopened. So the Delta variant is here, as they tell us, and but our government doesn't really seem keen to put us back into lockdown. It actually waived, interestingly, and maybe this is something I disagree with, but it waived the requirement for positive COVID tests to isolate. So if you test positive for COVID, there's no government order telling you have to stay at home for 10 days, which is interesting. But I don't know how much longer that will last. Hospitalizations are ticking up slightly. They tell us that most people in the ICU and in the hospital beds haven't been vaccinated. So the vaccines are still working, but they don't seem to be working at preventing transmission that much. So it seems like, I think what you have to do if you want to know what your country is going to look like when most people are vaccinated, is you look at Israel. Israel has been leading the way in vaccination targets, and now they're seeing a surge of COVID cases. So obviously it's not really helping transmission. It's helping reduce chance of severe outcomes, but look at Israel and that's your future. So it's, in some sense, it's pretty bleak because it looks like we're going to keep having waves of COVID, and how your government handles it is going to depend on where you're from.
Well, it's a nice...
it's a nice way to start the podcast. COVID will never end. Yeah, that's been a depressing realization over the past week, is that it's not really going to ever end. You're going to have constant waves. But think about it. If
the constant waves don't kill people, then...
Well, that's the thing. And don't overwhelm the system.
Some people are just going to have to die and...
Yeah.
And,
if you're counting waves from the Spanish flu, what would you be up to wave 400 and something of Spanish flu or the remnants of the flu?
And if we start catching it, start getting vaccinated against it, we'll start to build some sort of immunity to it. So, but I don't know.
It's a bit bleak. We'd have to belabor it.
Yeah. In other news, Rob, I've been considering alternative employment recently.
Mm-hmm.
I know how well this musician thing pays, but despite this, I've been examining my options. And I think, when you start jumping on Seek and these kinds of things, obviously all the algorithms find out and they all tell each other and start plotting some plans. And I've been getting targeted by the federal police, actually.
Oh, the big dogs.
They're could I want a job in surveillance?
Is what very topical.
So maybe they saw how passionate I was about CCP a couple of weeks ago. But and they asked me, do I feel like I'm someone who can blend in? That's what
definitely not with that beard.
That's what the federal police Facebook ad. So they're hiring, which is interesting, and they're probably hiring for a reason that Rob wants to talk about. You see, so Rob's been sending me some aggro messages in the middle of the night on Facebook. which is also known as our speaking points for this week.
Yeah.
And Rob, you're a bit stressed about this new initiative by the federal government, requiring people have to submit 100 points of identification in order to have a social media account. So you're a bit stressed.
We have two very troubling laws potentially that are going to be passed in Australia. We have, the first one, as Jules mentions, the government's going to ask for ID for you to be able to access Facebook in a bid to clamp down on online bullying. And the second one is the Identify and Disrupt Bill, which is going to give heightened surveillance powers and potentially the ability for these government agencies, the federal police, and another agency to edit and monitor online information, which is very, very dystopian. But the first one is a video that I'm going to play for everyone now.
A radical plan to crack down on social media abuse is being considered by the federal government. For more, Nine's Oliver Haig joins us live in Adelaide. Ollie, how will it work?
Layla, good morning. Essentially, it will work the same as a passport. Australians forced to submit 100 points of identification, like their driver's licence or passport, when using social media accounts like Facebook and Twitter. Now, police would have access to those social media accounts, and it's all part of a crackdown on online abuse. Now, users could be liable for defamation suits or even criminal prosecution, and it's all part of a plan hoping to deter people from engaging in bad behaviour. Now, the recommendations were handed down by a federal parliamentary inquiry. They're reforms that are being considered by the Morrison government, with the chairman saying there is merit to remove the veil of being anonymous. Layla?
So basically, as you heard, the government's going to be standing at the door with any tech platform, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and going to allow you to, and going to force you to submit ID. It's going to add some regulation into this industry, and the idea is it's going to clamp down on antisocial behavior. But it's terrifying to me, Jules, and something that's been keeping me up at night, just because it's now the idea that the promise of the internet, open communication, free discourse, free of government censorship, free of government involvement, is going to be turned over to the government only 20 years after that promise has been allowed to live. And it's why it's concerning to me is because it seems to have bipartisan support. We'll see if it eventually gets passed and in what form it takes. But at least the proposed legislation, that it's this handing over of power that I think has become, potentially acceptable and justified in a pandemic. Maybe you want to, hand over some powers to the government in a pandemic, but that same relationship with government has now been extended to areas that have nothing to do with the pandemic. And so how many of these draconian powers are going to be handed over to the government? And as soon as you do, there's no chance that they're ever going to relinquish that power and give it back. So that's got me pretty fired up. And now potentially Jules will be that person at the door telling you who can be allowed on and who can't.
I don't know. I've just got a feeling me and the federal police aren't going to be a cultural fit. I don't know how much reciprocal synergy there's going to be, Who knows? There's a couple of things to unpack there, Rob. So I reckon before we get too distilled into some of these concepts around bipartisan support for security measures, which seems to be the norm, this idea of gaining draconian powers out of crisis situations, I think we should talk about that. But I think there's an aspect of this law and these forms of regulation that you're missing there, and it's scam bots, right? So that would potentially part of the reason why you might want to bring in this requirement of having ID is so you can't create all these bots, right? Now, we already know in elections now, part of the security threat to these elections is these constructions of all these bots that create their own like echo chambers and make it look like they really support this initiative, or people are saying that the Russians were creating fundamentalist leftists,
Islam protests,
and all these different
groups,
kinds of stuff,
right.
and just and creating this illusion that there are actually these groups of people who believe these things, who are actually viewing this content, and so this way they're able to. It's like this propaganda ecosystem with all these fake accounts, right? But there's also there's that, which I'd love to learn more about actually, because it. But then there's also just your regular scam bots, right? So a pretty.
You didn't get scammed, did you?
Funnily enough, I did, and it's actually a pretty funny story. But I obviously play music in a band, Picket Palace. We were doing our first shows after the biggest lockdown in Melbourne ended earlier in the year.
Mm-hmm.
Shows sell out. You can't have that many people at the shows anymore, so the venues aren't really giving you door spots. So normally when I play a show, if I want some mates to come, my mum or whatever, I put people on the door. We weren't having like any door spots, or just one. And I met some girl and I wanted her to come, and we were out of tickets. So I went on the Facebook page for the event to my own concert, and I bought tickets off what was actually a scam bot, and it got rolled like $30.
Bot-fished.
I don't know. Maybe I've got a stake in this, Rob. Maybe I want protection. I want ID checks on all these
that's
Facebook
why they're
accounts.
recruiting you, mate. They know you've been personally victimized by anonymity online. But that is the argument, that it's going to crack down on anonymity. Say that 5 times really quickly. But the counter argument is that whistleblowers hide behind that anonymity to speak truth to power. So there is an argument that we don't need to have people's ideas online. I don't know which of those arguments holds more weight and which has more power. I just know that as soon as you take something that had such a beautiful promise, the internet of open discourse, open expression, a decentralized system, and now you turn the keys over to a government force that's not going to give it back. I think it's a sad day.
Does it potentially create the opportunity for there to be like a renegade movement in the internet? Where because Facebook, Google, Apple, these kinds of institutions become so large that they're forced into bed with governments, that people adopt a new approach to the internet.
Right. Well, that actually raises...
Is that and I wonder whether, if I was trying to be edgy, I'd probably look into things like the underground internet movement, and maybe there's people out there hoping to construct new more open platforms and stuff, right?
Well, that's right. So that's why people in cryptocurrency and decentralized systems and encrypted apps like Signal and Telegram and things like that have been pushing for it, and they've said that all this this marriage between government officials and tech companies has justified the need for decentralized systems even further. But what the point you raise is really interesting. It's not that the government has really cracked down too heavily on speech, in America and the Western world per se, but it's that there's been tech censorship, or more like content moderation on platforms, that's been doing the role that the government censors would have loved to do but couldn't, because all the communication is online. Which actually leads me to the second disturbing trend on like government censorship online, which is the US government has been in talks with big tech companies in its crackdown on misinformation. So here's Press Secretary Jen Psaki.
Well, I would say first, it shouldn't come as any surprise that we're in regular touch with social media platforms, just like we're in regular touch with all of you and your media outlets about areas where we have concern, information that might be useful, information that may or may not be interesting to your viewers. You all make decisions just like the social media platforms make decisions, even though they're a private sector company and different, but just as an example. So we're regularly making sure social media platforms are aware of the latest narratives dangerous to public health that we and many other Americans are seeing across all of social and traditional media. And we work to engage with them to better understand the enforcement of social media platform policies. So let me give you an example just to illustrate it a little bit. The false narrative that remains active out there about COVID-19 vaccines causing infertility, something we've seen out there flowing on the internet quite a bit and other places as well, which has been disproven time and time again. This is troubling, but a persistent narrative that we and many have seen, and we want to know that the social media platforms are taking steps to address it. That is inaccurate, false information. If you are a parent, you would look at that information and that would naturally raise concerns, but it's inaccurate. And that is an example of the kind of information that we are flagging or raising. So a couple of the steps that we have, that could be constructive for the public health of the country are providing for Facebook or other platforms to measure and publicly share the impact of misinformation on their platform and the audience it's reaching. Also with the public, with all of you, to create robust enforcement strategies that bridge their properties and provide transparency about rules. You shouldn't be banned from one platform and not others for providing misinformation out there. Taking faster action against harmful posts. As you all know, information travels quite quickly. If it's up there for days and days and days, when people see it, it's hard to put that back in a box. And of course, promoting quality information. Algorithms, I don't know how they work, but they all do know how they work. So those are some of the steps that we think could be constructive for public health, for public information, for public, and the right of the public to know.
But basically what she's saying is that they're going to be in talks with tech companies on what's considered misinformation. If they deem something that is misinformation, they'll obviously be in touch with tech companies to take that information down. And they're also concerned that if someone gets banned or their account gets suspended from Facebook, for example, why isn't their account being banned or suspended from Twitter? So why aren't these tech companies talking together? So not only does she want tech companies to be talking together, but she wants those directions to be coming from government. So you have some of those powerful companies in cahoots, controlled by the government, who is unable to, at least in America, restrict freedom of speech, but is using a private company where most of the discourse happens to crack down on speech. So it's a really dangerous, and this is where I think no one has any argument to say they're a private company, they can do what they want. Not really anymore. When you have the government telling you exactly what's considered misinformation and what's not, and you're using the private the private vehicle where it's legal to crack down on misinformation, it's legal to censor. That's if not a legal argument to violate the First Amendment, it's definitely happening in practice. And I think everyone should be pretty concerned. Why it's so troubling is because maybe you could say if there's all this wacky, fringy anti-vax content online, you're in the midst of a pandemic, you need someone to crack down on misinformation. This is killing people. If people don't get the vaccine, lives are being lost. The issue with that argument is misinformation is in the eye of the beholder, right? I'm going to define the speech of people I don't like as misinformation, and my own speech is fine. But obviously that presupposes that I'm free from error. I can never be possibly prone to speaking something that isn't true, which is obviously false. People are gonna get it wrong all the time, no matter if you're a tech executive, no matter if you're a government official, no matter if you're some alternative health account. And we've already seen this in COVID, right? In the beginning, everyone told us that masks didn't work. Then a few months later, we learned that was to protect the supply of masks, and that masks actually do work. And now, as the pandemic's gone on, we've learned that maybe masks don't completely protect people from new waves of COVID. They could be like part of the response. The point is that as time goes on, your idea of what's true actually evolves and changes. If you can do the same with the lab leak theory. In the beginning, it was considered fringe. Now it's considered very mainstream, and there's a high probability that Wuhan did come from a lab. So the point is that no one ever has a monopoly on truth and can definitively say what is the truth, but rather all these talks about protecting people and protecting truth and cracking down on misinformation is really a guise for and a justification for power and governments to prosecute their opponents.
Yeah. Another way of looking at it, Rob, is it was only just recently that the last president of the United States and his press secretary were being admonished for lying constantly.
Right.
Right? So whether it was about coronavirus, whether it was about potential impeachment inquiries, whether it was about Russia, whether it was about how many
so we
people,
know
how many
people in government are capable of lying.
how many people, about how many people were attending his inauguration.
Right.
We were being told that this is a lunatic presidential state. If it wasn't for the role of the media in that instance, being able to communicate information that was against what was being preached by the White House, then in that situation we would have been controlled and lied to. But in this instance, because it's not Donald Trump, because it's these establishment Democrats, they can be arbiters of what's true and what's not. There's not some overriding principle that says it might be silly to make the most powerful people in the country in control of information. There's no governing rule. It just seems to be who's in power. And that seems to be pretty ill-guided, in my opinion. You just had a president apparently constantly lie. Imagine if he was in control of what information was allowed to be spread and shared on Facebook.
That's exactly right. And you need to fumble and make mistakes in order to arrive at something that's the truth, right? The process of uncovering the truth requires people to have stabs at it in the dark, and there's a constant mechanism of open exchange that eventually gets you to truth. It's not people saying from the beginning, this is misinformation, this is disinformation, and this is the truth that gets you at the truth.
And also it's just not representative of how any of these political institutions actually work. While you were talking before, I was remembering about 2 elections ago in Australia, Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten, and Labor, with like a week or 2 left in the election, just started spending a fortune running these ads saying that the Liberal Party was going to privatise Medicare.
Medicare, that's right.
Right? Now, there was absolutely no evidence to this claim. It hadn't been spoken about as Liberal Party policy for honestly decades. There might, and like Medicare is our version of health insurance in Australia. It's like our free healthcare system.
Universal healthcare, yeah.
Right. Now the Labor Party just blatantly lied, spent millions on advertising to spread this lie, and ended up doing enough damage to make Bill Shorten, to make Malcolm Turnbull lose just enough seats that he was vulnerable, and he sort of needed to form an almost minority government. Anyway, these people lie so much. And I think what's been disheartening about this whole pandemic experience has been because these politicians have constantly been standing next to these supposedly impartial epidemiological experts or science experts or whatever else, because they've been standing next to these
hashtag science.
These doctors. It's like our instincts and our to not trust them based on grounded evidence that they lie constantly, frequently, from both sides of the political spectrum is problematic. And so on the one hand, you've had the highest level of distrust I think people have ever had in their politicians, right? I think the surveys over the last 50 years just show, even before Donald Trump, that no one really trusted politicians, that everyone had lost faith in all these public institutions. Yet we're on the precipice of the most centralized draconian regulation of information nearly ever between governments and media outlets. And I mean, it's just So it's that seems like those two things shouldn't be happening at the same time.
It's super scary. And then the Identify and Disrupt bill, which is something that I mentioned earlier before, basically is a bill that, according to this crikey article, human rights lawyers in the tech industry have criticized a proposed law that would give law enforcement extraordinary hacking and surveillance powers after federal politicians from both major parties gave their support to an amended version of the bill. There's an article from the Information Age, Australia is becoming a surveillance state, which is explains what it's going to do, which, tell me if this doesn't terrify you. Once the bill passes, it will dish out extra power to the Australian Federal Police and the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, giving the agencies access to new warrants that will let them modify and delete data. That's right, modify and delete data, collect intelligence from online communities, and even take over the online accounts of supposed criminals. So George Orwell has just been resurrected from his grave, has foreseen exactly what the government will try to do with he couldn't have even foreseen the technology that would have come about 80 years after his death, and how the government would try to get its hands into it, and now they actually are. And the idea behind it, of course, it's always going to have lofty goals. That's the way it gets implemented. They're cracking down on child exploitation, terrorism, things that everyone is against. How could you oppose the bill, Jules? Aren't you against child exploitation? Aren't you against terrorism? And of course, this is the same argument that any government would ever use to justify some sort of power is we got to, take down the thing that everyone hates without realizing that they're going to use this power for, other means. The fact that they can modify content online. So they go into a potential platform or website and edit what someone said. I couldn't think of anything more Orwellian. I know the George Orwell reference gets misused in modern society, but that is a complete new frontier for censorship and for government control.
Yeah, it's like the way that I conceptualize the philosophies that underpin limiting government. Those philosophies and those principles need to stand true regardless of the quality of leadership or government, right? So that's what underpins, in my opinion, the principles of limiting government. It's not the problem in China isn't that the CCP suck and the Liberal Party or the Labor Party is great. That's not the problem. The problem is the available control to the CCP to enact whatever agenda they want, right? It's this idea that ultimately incentives will always reward behaviour, and so these governments always have an incentive to get more power. And also this idea that in the noblest of political visions, if you start pursuing it with too much power, you'll end up corrupted and fuck the joint. And it's like we don't seem to value those principles anymore. And there has been a clear bipartisan degradation in rights and limitations on the government to surveillance, detain, etc., really since 9/11 is when the floodgates opened up. And you had, I guess, this critical concession on the right where the right of politics really stopped caring, especially in Australia, for these kinds of more old school liberal ideals of freedom and limitations on government. And I guess you could point that to this close relationship, at least in Australia anyway, between military, tough on crime, and the right wing, and the fact that terrorism and nationalism was a real driver of these initial sort of anti-terror laws, which were the beginning of this surveillance state establishment. And then I guess now we're using the pandemic and that crisis as a way to again
well, that's exactly right.
eat up more rights.
Even leaders who are potentially benevolent and, you know, who people love and people who would consider leaders of the people, Jacinda Ardern, New Zealand's Prime Minister, has come out and said, we'll continue to be your single source of truth. Let's have a quick listen.
I've been watching for some days, and this is not unique to New Zealand, that in the midst of what is a global issue, as you would expect, there are a number of rumours that circulate. I am present on social media, I see it myself. I cannot go around and individually dismiss every single rumour I see on social media, as tempted as I might be. So instead I want to send a clear message to the New Zealand public. We will share with you the most up-to-date information daily. You can trust us as a source of that information. You can also trust the Director General of Health and the Ministry of Health. For that information, do feel free to visit at any time to clarify any rumour you may hear, covid19.govt.nz. Otherwise, dismiss anything else. We will continue to be your single source of truth.
So you have Jacinda Ardern, the Biden administration, the Australian government, you know, people across the political spectrum, some have, you know, thought that this moment justifies a departure from normal legal norms and has justified censorship and crackdown. And this is why it's not acceptable even in an emergency. And this is why you need to, you know, if you care about the principles that you care about, they only really make sense. They're only really worth fighting for when there's a potentially a really good argument against it, right? You need to take it to the extremes. You need to be in a pandemic to see who really believes in these principles. Otherwise, these people don't believe in the principles at all. And
there's generally shaky grounds. I mean, look at the history of the national security laws that were brought into Australia, and what evidence is there that any of those laws made any functional difference in the prosecution of terrorists and the protection from terrorists? Do you know who those laws have been used against, Rob? The ABC. The ABC for successfully whistleblowing against the Australian Armed Forces for human rights abuses and mass murders that resulted in a external inquiry of the SAS operations in Afghanistan that put forward that there was serious human rights abuses. And what were the federal police able to do under these national security laws? Confiscate all of the computers at all of these ABC journalist offices. And the only reason the case was dropped was because it was literally up to the Attorney General whether or not it was in the national interest. And funnily enough, it wasn't in the national interest to prosecute journalists for alerting us to the human rights abuses of our military. Turns out that function of the press is actually quite helpful, but potentially politically inconvenient. And that's the point, potentially politically inconvenient. And so why is it appropriate for the Attorney General, former Attorney General, to be determining what is or isn't in the national interest in regards to the whistleblowing against government operations? I mean, you're your own judge and jury.
You and I have spoken a lot about this, about the need for some Bill of Rights, something that's strong, something that's like the American Bill of Rights and these inalienable rights that people can't take away, no matter how politically convenient it would seem. And Jules, one of those rights, which is something that's quite disturbed me watching from afar, maybe you can give me a first-hand perspective, is we've seen mass protests in Melbourne and Sydney over the last month against the lockdowns, against this COVID elimination policy. And of course, that gets merged in with all these colourful characters, these anti-vaxxers, and you can, fit anyone you want under that banner. But Dan Andrews saying that it is illegal to protest. His lockdown rules have made it illegal to protest. And then the thing that's it would be one thing. It would be one thing for Dan Andrews to come out with this really strong approach because he's committed to his goal of eradicating COVID. I can at least see the logic behind that. But what I don't understand is huge swaths of media, like both on the left and the right, The Age, The Guardian, The Australian, just condemning the right to protest in Australia. I would have never have thought that the right to protest would be conditional in my country. I don't recognize. It's not that I don't recognize the country that I'm looking at. I don't recognize how many intelligent people who I thought would be staunch defenders of human rights to just so blindly greenlight a government maneuver to crack down on the right to protest. So you have this editorial in The Age that I'm looking at now. You know, most Australians would have been blissfully unaware of the large and angry crowds gathering on the streets of Melbourne on Sydney afternoon. Yeah, why are they angry? This has been the most important political decision that has been made in my lifetime have been lockdowns. I don't think, it's one thing to argue about tax policy. It's one thing to argue about carbon policy. It's one thing to argue about, any other regulation. But, the right to work, the right to free assembly, the right to so many fundamental freedoms has been taken away. And you don't think people have the right to protest that? And, I was thinking about it. Is it the fact that Australia is so isolated that we have I'm not living in Australia anymore, have no comparison of how other liberal democracies have handled a pandemic?
Yes. It's
all throughout Canada, there have always been protests. Our chief health officer and our premier have always said, we're going to respect the right to protest even in a pandemic, but please follow these health guidelines. And then to top it off, obviously these people are, said to be following guidelines, but then you get this weird double standard that it's okay to protest against racism last year, but not to protest, someone taking your right to work away. And I'm not going to get into the merits of protesting either one of those things, but just this virus doesn't transmit outdoors. There's been, I think, not even a single recorded case of outdoor transmission in Australia. So the weird justification that it's protecting people's lives just doesn't make any sense.
I had someone share on Instagram. This was going around actually, of some photo of some really quiet protest for refugee rights.
Right.
Recently, in the last month, and then the caption was, all of those people who were protesting for our human rights must have just forgotten to show up. And then in my mind was I felt like replying and just being like, where were all the Black Lives Matter protesters? Or where were all the Invasion Day protesters?
Exactly right.
Yeah. it's like, oh yeah, they people pick and choose when they really decide to care about a human rights issue, and it's like, yeah, they do, including Black Lives Matter people and Invasion Day people. So Australia doesn't seem to have any real connection to liberal ideals anymore, and it's almost a shame that aspect of particularly the Liberal Party, is just gone. Well, and it seems like politically, from as far as the state governments go, they've just seemed to have done tremendously well out of being unbelievably hardline, and part of that's been hardline against each other. Mm-hmm. So the sort of politics it's played well. Being hardline, has really played well, and keeping the streets clean.
I'll go back to what I said at the beginning of the podcast, which is a really bleak outcome, is that even when Australia is at 80% vaccinated, COVID's still going to rage wild. People need to just look at Israel for that. And the day of reckoning is going to come where this stance has to end, where the completely draconian stance has to end. And, Australians need to ask themselves, are you happy with, the complete trampling of,
just
human rights and
also Australians don't understand,
freedoms.
And I would say Victorians don't understand how severe our lockdowns have been to other parts of the world, right? So
No idea.
Like, no guests at your home. Wasn't even we were apparently not in lockdown 3 weeks ago. We weren't in lockdown. You just couldn't have anyone over at your house. It was just this normal, regular life without having anyone, being allowed to have anyone at your house, being a gathering of more than fucking 10 people outside, and like it was. We were in lockdown before we were in lockdown. The non-lockdown we were in would have been the strictest lockdown that anyone in the most of the rest of the world has actually faced. But that wasn't lockdown. Lockdown started 2 weeks ago. Like we were already in lockdown. Now, I'm back to, most people at the moment aren't even allowed to go to work unless you're an essential worker. I can't go to the studio on my own, whatever. So I think generally there has been some sort of media. Yeah, this word lockdown, what it actually means, and how the rest of the world's going about dealing with this is obviously it's been circulating through media, but I don't know. There's been this very weird.
I just couldn't believe.
There's no other way. There's no other way.
Like I just couldn't believe.
It's like there's no other way. It's like
an
there's no other
Instagram
way.
post from the Australian shaming people for protesting. Shaming for people to exercise their right for protest, when if there's anything that justifies a protest, it's having your income decimated, the right to see your friends and family taken away, the right to do literally the right to normal life was taken away because it somehow was dangerous for you to attend an outdoor protest where there's virtually zero chance of transmission.
So so you're saying because the risk is so low. Like, what if the risk of outdoor transmission was really high?
So exactly. So what if COVID could spread outdoors? I would say that even if there's a risk of harm, the right to protest is unconditional. It's the fundamental cornerstone of a democracy that you can express your political opinion. We even have an implied right of political communication in this country. Australia doesn't have many constitutional rights, but something that very, very extremely smart judges, some of the the most brilliant legal minds, the most brilliant minds in Australian society implied a right to political communication in our constitution. It's so fundamental to the functioning of Australia that to take it away is to fundamentally transform the nature of the country. And even if there is a risk of harm, if you used harm as the justification to bar someone's right to protest, pretty much any political protest could have some harm because presumably you're protesting some harm that comes about from a policy, right? So if people are paraded on Bell Street to protest against speed cameras because they're overly draconian, they're overly in people's faces. People don't want to have a speed camera flashing them when they go 45 kilometers in a 40 zone. There's an argument that that law saves lives and protesting against it is going to cause harm. The idea, again, I think this goes back to a previous part of our discussion where, there's potentially a good argument to allow government surveillance because we could crack down on child pornography, child exploitation, terrorism, all the things people hate. Again, a virus spreading uncontrolled is probably something that everyone hates, but you don't even give them the right to define what it is that makes a protest illegal because they're going to use it in all different places, and it's always going to be used in a way to tackle what's politically inconvenient rather than being some objective, rational standard.
Yeah, which is why they didn't arrest any Black Lives Matter people, but they decided to arrest a shitload of these people because they want the people who are actually arguing something against them. They really want to crack down on them. And I mean, this is the other thing. It's like I was talking to my sister about it. We've just come out of, this huge, widespread Black Lives Matter protest movement, which is seemingly an anti-establishment stance against established power structures, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what it is, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I mean, isn't the reason black people have been so excluded from opportunities because those with power are corrupt, abuse them, and are often white and male?
Right.
Right? Isn't that's So if we're really interested in disrupting and disturbing power structures, we have to really care about who gets to approve or deny the validity of a protest. And according to the descriptions of power structures from this Black Lives Matter movement, the people who currently hold the right to determine the appropriateness of a protest are corrupt white males,
Right.
on average, wealthy, and wealthy off the back of exploitative power. So why, and also these Black Lives Matter protests were constantly having to fight against, against all of the potential COVID risks, right? And we're in this huge political battle where people still wanted to keep protesting. It's just in Australia they did it like once or twice,
Right.
once, but they were massive protests.
Right.
In America and stuff, they went on and on and on and on. But like the police that are killing Indigenous people in custody
Right.
are the same police that'll shut down your protest.
Or will
Right, they're not-
forcibly arrest someone for walking in the park without a mask when there's
Right.
no one within a 100-meter vicinity.
I mean, they're not.
Yeah.
It's not like you don't get. It's not like It's just the bad police. It's like the police can't be like bad when they're doing things you don't like, and then good when they're serving your own political interests. And again, it comes
Right.
to this idea of principles that are consistent regardless
That's right.
of who's in charge. And so,
And I think there's hypocrisy on both ends, Jules. So, no one who's anti-lockdown would have necessarily been attending the Black Lives Matter protest and vice versa. So both...
no, they could have been. They could have been. You could have easily
Could have
been
been.
both.
Yeah, potentially. But I think commonly when you hear someone who's on an anti-lockdown, within an anti-lockdown camp, and someone who's in a BLM camp, it seems like I think you and I,
Yeah, but
Jules,
this
would
is-
be the ones to protest against both. We're perfectly principled, of course.
This would
But
be no, but
you
this
don't
is
see a
this,
lot of overlap. I
No,
don't
this is a
think.
really interesting, very strange cultural political divide that I think bots are playing a role in. By the way, I kind of since we spoke about bots, I kind of now want to go and do a lot more reading because I'm now convinced that there's just armies of bots being used to create
Division.
false politics. But I'm now convinced of this, Rob. The conspiracy juices are bubbling away. No, this is really important to me. I don't think there actually is this idea that being anti-lockdown is like sort of white, anti-woke politics.
Right.
And then being for lockdown is being for lockdowns, being for masks, being for vaccines is woke. I think that's definitely part of it, and it's got to do with this idea of liberty and that kind of, I guess, an old-fashioned conservative, progressive wrestle for civil liberties.
Sure.
I think that is real, but I think there's also a class divide on these issues. And I think there's a lot of people who, and this isn't being represented, there's a lot of people that are actually working class that are really struggling with this pandemic and these lockdowns. And I also think if we want to look at vaccines, the underbelly that people don't want to talk about with vaccine hesitancy, which is an underbelly people generally don't like referring to when it comes to other social issues, is migrant populations.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think migrants have got nothing to do with right wing libertarian politics.
Right.
Have their own issues with this level of government infringement on their rights, being forced to take vaccinations, etc. And if you look at the UK, for example, what groups are massively overrepresented in vaccine hesitancy? And they are African migrants, as well as migrants from other parts of the world.
And if you look at the states as well, who's the group that's overly represented in vaccine hesitancy is the black population.
Right. And there's
Black
socioeconomic, and there are really good, there's a whole range of factors, isn't there?
Right,
You know, so
exactly
you could,
right.
You could say because
then-
they're disadvantaged, they don't have as much access to healthcare, aren't as well
Yeah.
educated,
And
et
there-
cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But really, you're talking about
people
class
keep referencing
divide.
a botched vaccine experiment in the past, which targeted blacks and led to a lot of side effects. I forget the name off the top of my head, but that actually brings me to the next point on vaccine passports, which, you know, it's interesting that you say, you know, the people who are vaccine hesitant are more likely to be disadvantaged, and I think that's true. When the topic was first brought up in the US, some of the civil rights groups, which remain the ACLU, which has changed its tide over the past decades. It used to be like, you know, a vehement defender of the right for Nazis to show up in Jewish towns to protest, but now less so. But it's still against vaccine passports, but it didn't necessarily cite freedom. It cited the disproportionate impact and issues of equity, in that it would make black people second-class citizens by virtue of their higher vaccine hesitancy rates. So it's interesting that it's no longer, it can't give you a clear enunciation of civil libertarianism anymore. It has to go into equity. But that's a side point.
Has to go into net outcomes. Well,
it has to look at woke issues. But we now have vaccine passports in France. You can't attend restaurants, gyms, bars unless you have a vaccine. Same in New York City. California's thinking of doing the same, and that might increase as the Pfizer vaccine or some of these vaccines get proper authorization as opposed to emergency use. But this is where we're at. Jules, you think it's inevitable that Australia is going to introduce some type of vaccine passport? They've been
people
chatting with the unions about it already.
It'll be like demanded by the mainstream here. Like it'll just be like, you're a fuckwit if you don't get vaccinated. You know, and it's like a growing reality. I don't think people really care about people's right to choose. They should just be excluded, and you should just not be allowed to do things unless you're participating in the overall health effort. Well, and I think it'll absolutely be functionally enforced, you know, and it looks like the way the state government's going to try and do it is just basically put laws in place that create the infrastructure for private companies to functionally enforce the rules.
Right.
So it's
right.
So, and I think what's going to happen
we're talking
is
about Facebook enforcing the government censorship.
Sure. And so it'll be like the government will say, oh no, if you're a gym, you're allowed to, like, I'm sure like high risk industries will be like, it has to. And then everyone else, it'll be like, it's up to you.
Yeah.
And then if you don't enforce it, people aren't going to come, and then you'll just get cancelled. And I think that's one mechanism. Or we'll all just, you know, make it compulsory by law like they're doing in France or whatever. I mean,
I don't know exactly what I think about this. If it is just a matter of restaurants deciding who can and can't attend their venues, if it is just a matter of, you know, workplaces, hospitals, any employer deciding who can and can't employ, you know, there's the libertarian instinct to say people still have a choice to do other things. I don't know when that argument falls down, at which point those choices are so limited across society. So, okay, I'm a tradie. I now have to quit my job because I don't want to get the vaccine, but I go from being a carpenter to an electrician. Oh, wait, I also can't be an electrician. To being a plumber. Oh, wait, I also can't be a plumber.
Yeah, so Rob,
your choice is functionally limited to very few professions, potentially just self-employment, and we know how well the self-employed have done in the pandemic.
There'll be some sort of revolutionary hippie underclass that will very quickly disintegrate into the straggly true believers. Because being all for the universe's spirituality and being grounded and living pure, I'm also convinced that this huge hippie vaccine hesitancy movement just hides under the cracks.
I think
they hide under the cracks. All the osteos.
I think it's wide open now. I think I think the vaccine hesitancy in like the yogi communities is through the roof.
Some of the stuff my physio and osteo mates have been texting. As far as they're concerned, they still don't think COVID's a real thing, you know. And these are and there's lots of them. And
speaking facts.
You know, well, I don't know. I think most people will just cave, Rob. You will basically not have any functional choice, and whatever principles there are around freedoms and liberties, whatever document that was in, right, has been set on fire that many times now. It just doesn't exist. Like, this pandemic said unequivocally, your right to do basically everything is conditional. Welcome to 2020. I was talking. This is very depressing. We'll see. We'll see if I capture the spirit of it well. So I live with my brother and his best friend since he was in prep, Rob Di Lorenzo, and it was his birthday. It was his 25th birthday last week, and his last 2 birthdays have happened in lockdown. And we were getting loose, and as you tend to do in lockdown, you talk about how it's affecting you, and it can be bleak. And what lockdown feels like, I think, is where your brain and your mind was previously able to drift to the infinite potential of things.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea that, imagine just like being in New York and the busyness of there and visiting here and going there, and I can do this and I can be there. This kind of inherent freeness, like the feelings you get when you're looking at the ocean and your eye can't see anything further past than ocean. It's like this will just be ocean. And unless someone had told you that if you kept going in that direction, you'd eventually hit another continent. If you didn't have that piece of information, you just assume, well, that's infinity, right?
Limitless.
That feeling is gone. It's definitely gone. And you for your brain to adjust to that is a type of poison. And we've now had that taken from us, and we'll be desperate to have back whatever we can. And people's desperation for relief is, as well as this well-regulated and controlled narrative and coercive power of the government, will mean people will just this will just happen. At least in Australia, I just can't see. I can't see any other way. And it is so important that we are able to feel like the world's an amazing, huge place, ready for us to see. So
well, fancy believing that and wanting to act on that, but the right to protest that in the streets is now illegal.
Well,
right?
Yeah, it's illegal and it's council. It's unwoke, so it's off brand. If you can't be at those protests either. But again, I think this is a very different situation amongst working class people, and I think like that kind of old school rock and roll perspective. My brother linked me some stuff like Eric Clapton, and that was
Eric Clapton
saying,
does not like the vaccine. So he's talking about
Van
under-reporting of the vaccine side effects.
Yeah, and Van, because he had a really bad experience, and then Van Morrison has been writing music, just like, what the
There's just no fucking way the hippies would have stood for this shit. Woodstock was hosted in the middle of the Hong Kong flu.
Yeah, well, and and this is the other thing. It's like, okay, so we have in America black people being more hesitant to take vaccines. And it's like, is that surprising that this huge group of society that feels totally mistreated, let down, exploited, and bullied by a system then doesn't choose to just trust whatever that system dictates? So, is that playing a role? I think I saw a drummer I follow, very famous drummer, he caught COVID despite being vaccinated. And he said something and it did spark that in me. He's like, look, I know you guys, he was really trying to get his black mates to get vaccinated. And he was like, I know you guys, we all feel there's justification to not trust these people, but please just get vaccinated so you don't get really sick.
Right.
And it's like, well, this is the question for all of us. We seem to all at once be able to, in our left hand, hold the realities of corruption and inequality and systemic abuse and corrupt degradation of democracy, and we go, the world's not that democratic. No one's wealth's really all that fair, and we really believe this. And at the same time, on our other hand, we're going as hard as we can, implementing what particular governments are saying is necessary for dealing with this pandemic. And so it's like total distrust and some sort of revolutionary change spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Take the power back. And then the other hand is let's...
Complicity, compliance.
Total and utter compliance and a whole new paradigm of control and surveillance. It's like if I was in China and I was at the freedom protests and I got all these people to show up to let's be our freedom protests, and then the next day the CCP put through new surveillance laws, I'd be nervous. But in that situation, it seems obvious. It's like, oh. But in this situation, for some reason, the cultural politics has actually brought those two political visions together, And it's but look, hey, I'm in lockdown. I'm overwhelmed with
Jules,
this
in
dystopian.
the words of my mum last week when I spoke to her, Rob, it's all fucked. And I couldn't agree more, Mum. It's very dark, but I'm somewhat optimistic because I do think, at least here in Canada and the States, there seems to be less reluctance to go back into lockdown. We haven't surrendered all our rights. We've got all our pre-pandemic rights here in Alberta. I don't know if that will happen in Oz, but open the border with the States. We'll see how long that lasts, but there is some hope. I just think, look, it's a pretty bleak, trifecta: government censorship, taking away the right to protest, vaccine passports implemented pretty universally, but there are a lot of people talking about how insane it is. I'm hopeful that all of these things won't be implemented in their full form, and I think there is potentially something to grasp onto.
Yeah, and there's not. Like you're dreaming. So, and yeah, I just need to decide whether I'm going to be a part of this this hippie underground movement that just exists on the fringes. I don't think so. I think I like playing music too much. But
well, I think on that note, Jules, we will wrap this one up. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time.
I think they're all insane.
And one final thing, if you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word and let your friends and family know about it. And also, if you haven't already, make sure you hit subscribe. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit the like button and notification bell. See you next time.